With our final lecture of the semester, and we are looking at Veena Das's What Does Ordinary Ethics Look Like? Now, so she opens with a little bit of stage setting, introducing several figures, people, and concepts that will be central to her inquiry, and then she moves on to sort of the motivation behind the essay. She says, what is it that blocks our ability to see the everyday and hence to imagine the ethical as inhering in the quotidian rather than standing out and announcing its presence through dramatic enactments of moral breakdown or heroic achievement? We're going to see this appear sometimes explicitly, sometimes quite subtly over the course of all of the things that she considers throughout the essay. And she approaches this through these sort of 5 clusters of inquiry. First, whether there can be harmony between our moral vocabularies and the worlds in which we live. Then, what becomes of the ethical when pitched in terms of the everyday. Third, how can we make the everyday visible when what is before our eyes is so often invisible to us? How might we understand being with others with respect to the grammatical constructions of the first person, second person, and third person? And finally, how can we think of the ethical as an expression of life as a whole, not just as sort of congealed in moments of crisis? So first section, aligning our concepts with our lives, or what gives concepts life. We notice right away the difference between Das's line of questioning and Keene's. He was interested in the objectification of concepts. Das, on the other hand, cautions against thinking that we know in advance or once and for all what the boundaries of a concept might be, and sets a distinct 2-part agenda for thinking about ordinary ethics. First of all, asking, what is it to live with concepts? So, I'll let her speak to that. And then secondly, what does it mean to say that concepts have life? First, beginning with to live with concepts. She begins her consideration of what it is to live with concepts by drawing on Ludwig Wittgenstein. First, to make the point that with, for example, the concept of pain, the important thing about pain is not that I ascertain whether or not you're actually in pain, as if my certainty is what's at stake, but rather that I respond in a particular way. Why? Because what's at stake is our future together. My response is about our future together, not about my certainty of your pain. So in connection to this, she explains that intellectual discussions often occupy themselves with setting boundaries on concepts. She asks, though, does the concept of pain have fixed boundaries? Well, and we can see, given the centrality of something like pain to ethical considerations, or the way that we might think of pain in relationship to ethics, this is not a neutral question. This is not just a throwaway inquiry. This kind of thing about the bounding of a concept of something like pain is crucial to how we would approach ethics. So then, assuming concepts like sets have sharply defined boundaries, a set like a numerical set, or a set of things that count as bottles. That's going to be a set of things that we can draw in principle sharp boundaries around. So assuming that concepts like sets have sharply defined boundaries, this assumption leads us to fail, leads the concepts to fail us exactly when moral issues are at stake. So she takes the example raised by another theorist of the question of person And in the case of something like abortion, trying to draw a clear, sharply defined boundary around person is clearly not a straightforward thing to do and could not be more elemental to the conversation about abortion ethics and abortion rights. So the ethnographic lesson may be to avoid starting with sharply bounded concepts or the assumption of sharply bounded concepts, and instead to see how people actually use a concept, what its related concepts are, to chart out their range of applicability. And through that, we might find that sharp boundaries serve no need. So if we were to take, this is a kind of a Wittgensteinian example, if we were to tell someone to stand roughly by the door, stand near the door over there, then having a sharply defined sense of what is by the door or near the door or roughly at the door is just not helpful, right? It doesn't, it's a kind of precision that is out of place with that kind of a request. And yet the request can serve perfectly well. We don't need greater precision, greater specificity than just stand near the door. And we get our fellow here standing roughly near the door. It works. It's good enough. The kind of attention to people's uses of concepts can alert us to how concepts grow out of life, right? So it's not like we have life here, concepts here, and we try and somehow fit them together, but rather that life is productive of concepts. Then we can attune ourselves to how people live with concepts, not as these kind of discrete things that we choose among, as if we have this menu of concepts that we can select from, but rather as the sorts of things that force themselves upon us. So if I asked you to look at the drawing below, the circular one there, and say what it is, then the just sort of reactive response would be to say it's a face. It's not like you need to find your menu of concepts, consult the various different options, and then go, face, it's face. No, the concept forces itself upon you. Now, the duck rabbit here, the drawing on the right, this is one that Wittgenstein discusses as well, though he's not the creator of the drawing or the concept. But he takes this as an example of how concepts force themselves upon us, in the sense that some people will look at it and immediately see a duck facing to the left. Others will look at it and immediately see a rabbit, its ears trailing out behind it, looking to the right. But the point that Wittgenstein wants to make with this is that you can't really see both at once. You need to switch from one to the other. Again, because there's a way that concepts force themselves upon us, that it takes a certain work to switch from the one to the other. So then Das characterizes her position like this. I argue thus, it is the internal relation that language as a whole, including gestures and physiognomy of words, bears to the world that provides the soil from which concepts are grown. This means that instead of thinking of a specialized vocabulary that draws boundaries around the notion of the moral or the ethical, all grids on which moral theory is seen to move, it might be important to think of the ways in which ethics is embedded in what Wittgenstein calls the whirl of organism. So then what does this look like? Well, she draws on the American philosopher Stanley Cavell, who was a great reader of Wittgenstein himself, on the projection of words. So what does that mean? Well, we learn a word in a specific context, but then over time we learn to project it into further contexts. So consider the word feed as an example. So we can feed ourselves, we can feed our pets, we can feed a lion, but then we could also feed someone a line. We can feed a parking meter, we can feed someone's ego, and so forth. The word can be projected into further contexts. This is part of the reason that we should not start with the assumption of sharply bounded concepts, because we project them in the words we use into sometimes unanticipated novel contexts. So as Das points out, it's through this practice that we learn not just the nuances of our language, but also the nuances of the world. That is, we learn language and the world together. It is then, she says, in the give and take of ordinary life that concepts acquire life, not separately from life, but from the living of life. She goes on. If concepts have vitality, this must be drawn from the life they participate in, and not the desire for abstract reasoning alone. The ethnographic task is to show in what ways concepts of the moral or ethical emerge in life, just as the concept chair might emerge only in relation to new body techniques of sitting, the valuation of the above and below, and so on. So then, to get a handle on ethical life, let's shift our attention from the meaning of words, like good or bad, to what we, or our interlocutors, mean when we use them, and how we show that they matter to us. So take, for example, promising, which we could extend to include all sorts of adjacent everyday concepts and practices like forgiving, excusing, blaming, and so forth. We can see with a concept like promising that it is no more extraordinary than the concept of chair, and yet it can do all sorts of ethical work in our lives. It doesn't require the idea of ethics doesn't require grand concepts. It does arise out of these quite quotidian concepts. She concludes that one cannot give a once and for all definition of the good. So this was a question that was posed to her in a symposium, posed to the other members of the symposium as well. And she says, we can't give this once and for all definition of the good. We've just gone through this conversation of the projection of words and the projection of concepts, so we can see how that resistance to giving a final definition articulates with the idea of being able to project a word or to project a concept. They're open-ended. So no once and for all definition. She hints then that perhaps it's a question that leads us in the wrong direction in any case. Instead, she suggests that we proceed by way of examples, so that we don't try and give a definition of the good, but we try to give examples. And through our examples, we start to gain an appreciation for how the concept of good gets life and how people live with the concept of good. What happens to our concepts when they become unmoored from the basis on which they rested? Can they fall out of harmony with life, in other words? As an example, with the loss of the concept of divine law, what happens to the moral ought then? So the moral ought being the idea that if there's a divine figure, a God, who gives you your moral prescriptions, then those are the things that you ought to do. What happens when you lose that notion of the divine and therefore the moral ought? It may persist, writers like Alistair MacIntyre say, but lose their content because they've lost the traditional context in which they could be significant, so that they can't live the same kind of life in this view that they lived when the notion of the moral ought was wedded to divine law. Das, however, is not really persuaded that we can just so easily separate out modernity and tradition, a crucial distinction for MacIntyre's claim that the divine law and the moral ought have become disconnected from one another. She does, though, consider the possibility that words from older moral vocabularies still might circulate in the present, albeit in a weakened state, such that we cannot use them with conviction. Our changed world leaves us unable to explain ourselves to ourselves in these terms. So then she's not claiming that that moral vocabulary, that moral language is dead. It's a dead language. But rather that it's doing something like slumbering. It's gone to sleep. If we take as an example Kant's view of values as ends and how it presumes a certain moral picture, one in which the world is fundamentally benign, and following the moral law will make available to us an enlightened happiness superior to the one that only satisfies our desires. You can recall from our earlier lectures the relationships that he draws between autonomy and heteronomy, and the distinction that it bears on freedom and morality. So that if we get our directives for our action from our desires, from our whims, from our impulses, he says we're not acting autonomously, we're acting heteronomously. Something else is giving us the principle of our action. But then, if Kant's optimism for morality through the categorical imperative, autonomy, and the associated freedom that you get out of acting through duty to the law, if that kind of optimism is organized on the assumption of a benign world, Das says, what happens if we lose our trust in this benign world? What life does his moral vocabulary have then? It may be that it doesn't simply disappear. It doesn't become a dead language, as I said, but that it enters something like a slumber. So then it's not only that the ordinary is a realm of moral safety and redemption, or it's not the case that the ordinary is a realm of moral safety and redemption. It's not like you can take refuge in the ordinary, in the everyday, in the quotidian, and that there you'll find only redemption, only moral safety. Rather, it is, she says, a modality of being in the world in relation to the world's malignancies. And through her emphasis on following out examples of the ethical, she sees it as an anthropological project to describe what ethics of this sort entails, how the small quotidian acts stand up to the horrific. This is one of the main reasons I wanted to keep this particular reading for this course, is that it draws our eye, when we're considering something like COVID, not to the massive scope of the crisis, but rather to the small acts that people undertake in response to crisis, in response to horror, as they try and figure out how to position themselves and one another with respect to a world that appears malignant, and where things like the security of those close to you is no longer just given, that's something that falls into question now. Am I a danger to those around me? Are others a danger to me? And so forth. Can we agree on the fundamental requirements of our security with one another and with our communities at large? So then it's how small acts, small everyday acts, stand up to crisis stand as responses to pandemic. This is the kind of thing that we can look for. She opens this section on the ordinary, the lens of the ordinary, by wondering where we might look for the ordinary. Does it always have the appearance of the ordinary, for example? She has two initial thoughts in response. The first is that the distinction between the ordinary and the extraordinary can sometimes arise from grammatical illusions. This is an idea she is borrowing again from Wittgenstein. Grammar here referring to philosophical grammar, so not linguistic grammar, philosophical grammar, which has to do with the way that criteria tell us what an object or emotion or rule is within a form of life. So that to share a form of life, I'll say more about that in just a moment, has to do with whether we share criteria, and the organization of that criteria is grammatical in nature. So an example that she would give quite frequently is to say, we take a phrase like, "It's raining outside, but I don't believe it." That there's something grammatically wrong, not in the linguistic sense. Linguistically, it's a perfectly fine sentence, but there's something wrong in the grammatical sense, philosophically speaking, in that sentence. And it has to do with the criteria for belief. That something that I know, I can't contradict by saying that I don't believe it. That's not given in the grammar of belief. So then this would be sort of the way that grammar and criteria fit together, philosophical grammar again, and criteria fit together within a form of life. Secondly then, the ordinariness of everyday life makes it difficult to see what is before our eyes. And so to make the ordinary perceptible, we need to imagine the forms it takes. So because the ordinary is, so to speak, our medium, it's hard for us to see it as a fish to water, to follow the metaphor, right? So then the way that we gain access to it is through the ways that we imagine it. If we imagine the ordinary to be the domestic or the neighborly or the repetitions of day-to-day life and so on, this is sort of what allows us to make the ordinary perceptible. Now, the forms we imagine will also guide us to the specific threats that we see to the everyday. So if we think of the ordinary as sort of the workaday life, economic catastrophe would be the threat that we see to it. If we think of the ordinary as the place of intimacy, then the way it can arise is as doubt about the sincerity of a loved one's affection or attachment. So you can think of Shakespeare's play Othello here as an example. If we think of the ordinary as familial, then skepticism about the trustworthiness of kin would be the threat that we would perceive to it. These, by the way, we're not depicting rules about what stands as a threat. These are examples. Taken together, we can gain an overarching sense of the everyday as, quote, a site on which the life of the other is engaged. This is important. We're not given a picture of the ordinary as isolated individuals here. It is the site on which the life of the other is engaged. For us as humans, being with defines a mode of being in the world, and by extension, the ways we both inhabit and flee from the social. Because, of course, the social is not, again, just this sort of benign realm of redemption and safety. The social is also the site of all of the sorts of threats that I've just mentioned above and others beyond. Das returns to Wittgenstein to explore how we fall prey to the superstitions or grammatical illusions we create for ourselves when we take forms of life to be sharply bounded and alien to one another, much as the idea of culture or cultures used to be in, among other places, anthropology. So this idea that you would have a group, you can give that group a name, it's clear who falls within that group and who falls outside of it. There are no ambiguities, and it has this kind of homogeneous inclusiveness. That is a notion that draws on this idea of having sharply defined boundaries. So this, says Wittgenstein, is what Fraser, a famous early anthropologist, does when using terms like ghost or spirit in his description of fire festivals, these particular superstitious or religious festivals and rituals, generating with those words, ghost, spirit, in an English speaker, feelings of dread, yet without acknowledging that the very use of the ordinary English terms points to the translatability of these others he describes. Excuse me. So then, form of life is this notion drawn from Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. Again, it frustrates any sort of pithy definition. One way that we could approach it, though, is to pay attention to the emphases on both form and life, and return to ideas of philosophical grammar. So form we could think of as these sort of the conventional ethnographic ideas of things like custom, tradition, norms, things like that, that we could see operating on one axis. On the other axis, we could think of life. So that it's not just forms of life, but also forms of life. So that there we would discuss criteria for what is included as a particular kind of life, what is included as human life, and how do we draw the distinctions between human life and other life. Again, these are criterial or grammatical questions, but that when we go to think about something like social inclusiveness, it's not just going to have a presence in terms of being able to get along smoothly according to a particular group's customs. You can do badly with customs and still be regarded by those people who share those customs as a human being of a sort, just not perhaps of their kind of person. But then you can also run up to sort of limit cases where we wonder, how do we understand this being as a human at all? When we come to the end of our criteria, that's sort of where we hit a limit about a shared form of life. So these are somewhat more extravagant examples than I like to give, but sometimes, for the sake of time, an extravagant example can make the point economically. So if we take someone like John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy, when we go about understanding, when we go about talking about how we can think of them as humans, why they're so puzzling to us as humans, for the most part, the way that we talk about them is how they're unlike, quote unquote, normal humans, how they don't have the same feelings of sympathy or empathy for other humans. How rather than being, say, horrified at the pain of others in general, they take pleasure in it. So then what do we find? We find that we've run into a limit of shared criteria when we describe these sorts of individuals. And which is not just all psychopaths. I mean, it matters that there are psychopaths with whom we can actually carry on. These are not psychopaths with whom we can carry on. And so as we go to describe them, I think you can say what we wind up describing is how we run into the limits of our shared criteria with them. And beyond those limits, where they lived a significant portion of their lives, is how they become befuddling to us as humans. We're not sure how we can think of them as fellow humans. Okay, moving along though. So could we not also see in the performances of the Fire Festival practices as ordinary, not dreadful, as kissing a photo of a loved one, which again, we're not kissing the loved one, we're kissing an image, we're kissing a piece of paper, and yet we can get a comparable feeling of satisfaction from doing that. Das writes in this connection, what I take from Wittgenstein's remark is that the familiar word ghost gestures to the fact that an understanding derived from the common background of our lives as humans is implicated in the description of savage customs. The fact that Fraser can use such words at hand as ghost and shades connects our lives to that of the so-called savages. Their customs can be imagined within our form of life as a human form of life. So then our everyday language can be a way to alienate others or other forms of life, but our use of everyday vocabularies to describe the other also points to the ways in which we might see their form of life as a human one. That they might differ in customs, they might differ in rituals, and yet our very ability to describe them in everyday terms signals to us what we share as much as what separates us. There lies in this move the possibility of dissipating the feeling of alien estrangement in others' customs or habits or ritual performances that strike us as strange, by imagining the possibility that these connect with things we do habitually. Right? So that, again, the idea of ghost or spirit we can deploy them as a way of trying to erect a boundary between us and others. But we also, in doing that, ought to recognize that these are everyday words that have a long heritage in our own forms of life. And so there's a sense in which that boundary is really quite elusive, perhaps rather fabricated. To explore this possibility then, Das takes two ethnographic examples that respond to three questions she poses. First, how might we bring harmony between our words and our worlds, given that truth is not a matter of fitting propositions to reality as if they were made for each other? Again, as if we have propositions here, reality here, and they just connect like that. Again, remember, she's thinking of concepts as growing from life. Second, if we picture the everyday as the site where I engage the life of the other with all its threats and possibilities, what purchase does the idea of harmony between language and world have? Finally, what does ordinary ethics and its denial look like within this picture of the everyday? So experiencing fairness and experiencing the other as a threat. She starts off taking an example of Aaron from Catherine Smith's work in Halle, United Kingdom, who responds to his feelings of unease over women in his area wearing the niqab, demonstrated here, by wearing a balaclava, also pictured here, to pubs in protest, proclaiming as a justification, "This is my religion." We can see this as quotidian prejudice directed at local Muslims, excluding them from a shared life. But in addition, we can see how, following Wittgenstein's critique of Fraser, talking about Muslims in this way also begins, to make what would have been an everyday unremarkable practice elsewhere a subject of great excitement, a sense of becoming disjointed with life in this part of working class England, leading to feelings that there can be no space prepared within this form of life for Muslim others. Das continues, pointing out that Aaron seems not to understand his actions are in the nature of a flight from the everyday, prompting pub owners to react to his display as parody and ask him to leave. So Aaron, in trying to mobilize sympathy for his discomfort around those he wishes to exclude, takes flight from the everyday in a way that makes him discomforting for his neighbors. So there's a way then that he is, through his reaction, removing himself from a particular form of life, making himself alien within a particular form of life. Nor does Aaron or others sharing his unease imagine different possible forms of interaction that might explore points of connection they share with their Muslim neighbors in other regions of their lives. So this is a strategy Das has seen at play and in failure in her own and others' work in India. She points then not to sort of grand programs of reconciliation, but again to small acts of everyday repair that offer the possibility, but not the guarantee, of containing potential violence. The everyday, like language, has an intrinsic openness that allows for its transfiguration, such that small slights, gossip, jealousies can erupt into violence. So very small things can produce these very large, explosive kinds of violence. But also that one can discover in a form of life space for others that one has not previously perceived. That is, it's not that the others have not previously been perceived, but that the space has not been. On this point, Das writes, "Of course, there are no guarantees that the imagination of this other in my life will work, and not swallow up my confidence that the form of life itself might not disappear. But it is precisely this uncertainty that becomes the challenge for everyday ethics." So again, what do we see here? We see the everyday as the site of ethics. We see that ethics is, in this way, responsive to the concrete details of a lived life, rather than being this kind of separate realm, distinct from everyday life. She turns then to a second case to illustrate Wittgenstein's idea that examples help us see how to go on. Her point about the openness of the everyday or forms of life to transfiguration finds an example in the way human rights emerged in Thailand. So she devotes a couple of paragraphs to this. I'll just read them. Okay, she says on pages 80 and 81, "Let me take a somewhat different example, that of how a new language of human rights is absorbed within a society that considers this language first to be alien, but then opens itself to it through aligning its own conventions to the possibility of newness." In his work on human rights in Thailand, Don Selby, that would be me, traces the trauma in Thai society at the potential of violence within Buddhism, which came to the surface in the brutal suppression and massacre of student demonstrations in 1976 in Bangkok in the course of the democracy movement. For many Buddhists, there was the further trauma of remembering that the killings had been justified by powerful Buddhist monks such as Kitiwutu Bhikkhu, who argued that it was meritorious to kill communists since they were the personification of Mara, or in Thai, Man, the evil incarnation in Buddhism, whose purpose is to destroy Buddhism. Are the teachings of Buddha then capable of generating such brutal violence? Social conventions did not permit open discussions, but Selby suggests that these anxieties were addressed through another language, that of human rights, within the institutional spaces of the newly established National Human Rights Commission, constitutionally mandated in 1997 and finally constituted in 2001. Selby tracks how initially the language of human rights was treated as something that was simply overheard, as if the Thai people were not the direct addressees of this discourse, but had come to participate in it through indirect means. However, as complaints from citizens began to pour in and were adjudicated, the language of human rights came to be treated as another potential contained within Buddhism and not as coming from the West, as they thickened and gathered weight. The traditional institutional mechanisms, such as those of facework or of patronage relations, were bent and extended to do work for the Human Rights Commission. This is a fascinating example of how a space of possibility for newness was created by reinterpretation of what Buddhism might mean in the context of aspirations for democracy. Selby's comments that even without a proximal scene of devastation, so no requirement of crisis, proximal scene of devastation, an event can occasion a turning back to the ordinary in novel ways. So again, the ordinary is the site of this innovation, the emergence of novelty. He thus thickens the notion of the actual everyday by showing the potential of violence contained within it and tracking how newness might be absorbed within the scene of sameness to address moral disquiet. So this is one example then of the way that the ordinary, the everyday, contains within it both these potentials for extraordinary violence, but also the potentials for ethical response to that same violence through innovation, through novelty. She follows the example from Thailand with Talal Assad's account of the Arab Spring in 2011 in Egypt, where he considers the confluence of tradition, aspiration, and newness in the political struggle for a more just system. She highlights two important points in Assad's analysis. First, when one thinks of newness in terms of collective political action, it involves tectonic shifts that might be in the nature of slow changes that are not on the surface. So the image here being tectonic plates in the Earth's crust that will move very, very slowly, not on the surface, far beneath the surface, but yet can produce dramatic changes. Second, it involves the mobilization of energies that go into bringing newness at the political level. Though he's pessimistic, Assad is pessimistic about the likelihood of political change in Egypt, Das reserves the possibility that collective uprisings may generate potentials on the margins of consciousness that grow into something currently unthought. Again, the possibility for newness, the possibility for innovation, for the emergence of novelty. Said otherwise, one might ask if even failed political projects leave residues in the form of potential or unfinished stories that might appear later in new ethical sensibilities. So she takes this as an opportunity to recast the everyday in terms of the potential, the actual, and the eventual, instead of the old tropes of everyday as nothing more than the site of routine, repetition, and habit, right? That here we can see the everyday or the ordinary, as to borrow a term she'll come back to later on, sort of pregnant with possibility, potential, even though it might not be visible or actualized in the moment. In her ethnographies, Das has described how places racked by violence, so proximal crises, in contrast to what we were just hearing in my description of Thailand, racked by violence, did not have just a moment of horror. So that's not the full story. The moment of horror happened, but that's not the full story, but rather carried this horror into the life of those who re-inhabited the scene of devastation, suggesting that, quote, if we are to live in this place of devastation by picking up the pieces, the rubble, and remaking that place, we would need a different picture of what is destroyed in our lives and what it is to pick up the pieces again. So if we stay just with the moment of crisis, just with the horror, just with the devastation, then we're left with a picture that doesn't allow us to understand, again, her emphasis would be how myriad small acts participate in the re-inhabitation of that scene of destruction, that work of picking up the pieces to live again. The work of mending, for example, of accepting poisonous knowledge into one's life. This poisonous knowledge is a moment that she describes in this piece and in other pieces as well. So the poisonous knowledge of discovering the malignancy of your kin relationships. Accepting poisonous knowledge into one's life may be the work of small decisions and acts, sometimes under such constraints that it's not clear if the term choice actually describes them. Why? Because choice has this implication of maybe complete, maybe simply adequate knowledge to arrive at a rational decision about what one wants to do. That's not always the case. We don't always have, and in the example she produces, the protagonists clearly do not have anything like a clear, adequate understanding for something like a choice, and yet they must act. And so it's through these small acts that are sometimes done in circumstances of great ambiguity. This is the kind of mending that she's talking about, these small acts of mending. So by insisting on attention to the singularity of a life, not grand theories, singularity of life, and how individuals might work on their own culture, she also directs our attention to the inadequacy of thinking in terms only of obligation and freedom. These great Kantian tropes. This is a problem implicit, she thinks, in her use of the word choice. So she's giving something of a critique of her previous description of what one of her protagonists, Asha, did in very difficult circumstances after having lost her husband as a young woman. Now Das thinks that Asha engaged in small acts of mending despite the fact that her life remained significantly opaque to her. So again, this is a question of re-inhabiting the scene of destruction. She's lost her husband. Her kinship relations are tenuous and, again, sometimes poisonous. So not through grand acts then, not re-inhabiting through grand acts, but many small ones, even in the face of uncertainty and ambiguity. again, this is the kind of thing that I think that we can attend to in interviewees when they talk about COVID. Very often what we'll find, I think, is that it's not grand acts that people engage in, but it's many small ones under circumstances of severe uncertainty, um, of a great lack of confidence in the reliability of information or of what people say, and yet having the requirement to act in the world, to continue. And so these small acts may be just the stuff that give us a picture of how people go about enduring and repairing the damage to their lives wrought by COVID. So then she wants anthropologists to think of language use in terms of expression, to concentrate our attention not just on what one means when one speaks, but also what one expresses. So in a way, this frees us from the pressure anthropologists sometimes feel to uncover narrative coherence in what people say to us. Once we consider language not just as a way of communicating information, but as expressive, so that we can get not at the coherence of the story that someone tells us and what it means in some complete sense, but also what people express in telling that story. In this way, then, Das remains alert to the ways in which the everyday is not simply the world of routines or habits, but is shadowed by doubts that can become world annihilating. So we see everyday life as laced with fantasy. Continuing this thought, she pushes into the foreground the nature of the specific, singular relationship she had with Asha, Manjit, and others, explaining that their candor, the way they made themselves known to Das, had to do with the specificity of that relationship, which is something, a recorder could not only could a recorder not capture it, but it would interrupt that relationship, because it's not the same thing to talk to a voice recorder as it is to talk to a friend. So just to be clear then, she doesn't think that fantasy in the everyday lies only on the side of the anthropologist's interlocutors. We've already seen this with Wittgenstein's critique of Fraser. It can also make its way into the ethnography. So here, one of the, I guess you could say critiques, one of the critiques that she's leveling is against the anthropological fantasy that the other can be made completely transparent if only we have enough technology and the right kind of technology to capture the other. Here she's suggesting that actually those efforts, those technological efforts, say, to gain, to aspire to this fantasy of complete transparency of the other, in fact gets in the way, at least in the cases she's describing here, of forging a relationship with the other, a relationship that can be the basis of some kind of understanding, a relationship in which one can gain access to the expression of the other, not just the meaning of the words of the other, but how the words are expressive of the other. So this connects to the distinction between speech and voice. The former, speech, you can capture with a recorder. The latter, voice, an anthropologist might simply miss or might apprehend, as in hearing a phrase uttered to her at one point, "It is our work to cry and your work to listen." which sounds like a descriptive statement, but the way that Das took it, because of the singularity of the relationship and her attentiveness not to speech simply, but to the voice of the other, she took it as an imperative that this individual was not simply giving a description of a state of affairs, but was telling her, it is your work to listen. It's our work to cry, and it is your work to listen. So again, it is your work to tune into our expressiveness. Again, not something that you can simply capture through better and better technology. Okay, moving on. So the triadic structure of social interaction is something that we've come up against in a number of the readings so far. Again, this relationship between first person, second person, and third person. Das begins her consideration of the second person standpoint, taking up Stephen Darwall's definition as the perspective you take in relation to me when we make and acknowledge claims on one another's conduct and will. She shows this with an example of stepping on someone's foot, though she differs from Darwall in saying that I must remove my foot, perhaps adding an apology, even if I cannot articulate a valid reason for doing so. She thinks that Darwall's thinking through of my removing my foot and apologizing just doesn't sound like something that you see in everyday life. Why? Because he has the person removing the foot thinking things like, well, I will remove my foot because that is what will make the world a better place. No, she says, that's not really how we live. I simply remove my foot because that's what I do. I'm this kind of human, responsive to you. And so I'm acting out of my responsiveness to you, not my responsiveness to this kind of overarching principle of what will make the world better. No, my responsiveness is to you. I don't need to be able to articulate some kind of contractual agreement that this is what's required of me. This is my ought. Or that I don't need to be able to explain to you or to myself or anyone else that I did this in order to make the world a better place. No, it's simply what I do. Her point about this unexplained response to stepping on your toe is not deficient for its lack of explication or obedience to a contractual obligation, but shows that something about our embodiment takes into account the concrete other to whom we respond without the necessity of pausing a contractual framework of agreement. So if such a response is an acknowledgement of your humanity, then withholding the response can also be a withholding of my acknowledgement of your humanity, with all the disastrous potential that entails. So that the scene that we have of I simply remove my foot because that's what I do, also is, to borrow her word again, laced with this quite gloomy alternate possibility that my failure to do so is a failure to be responsive to you as a fellow human. She follows Cora Diamond in considering the second person not so much a standpoint as an absorption in the mutuality of life we might create for each other. So this mutuality is something also that I can deny by withholding my acknowledgement, by withholding my absorption in this mutuality. The second person, with its implicit interaction, is, Das argues, a necessity of the ethical. We have here, she says, a picture of the ethical as embedded within these moments of recognition that contain within them also the lethal possibility of the denial of each other. So once again, this is the stuff of the ordinary, or this is the stuff of everyday life. It doesn't therefore constitute simply a refuge or a place of redemption. It also contains within it these possibilities for denial and all the disastrous consequences that can spin out from them. Das proposes that we might rethink the non-contractual basis of our moral and ethical lives with respect to the place of trust as an essential feature of our conversations. So then trust here is not primarily a question of certainty. Again, we come back to this theme that was raised over the question of pain and your expression of pain. Your expression of pain is not an occasion for me to work out my certainty about your pain. It is an occasion for me to respond, and the nature of my response will have everything to do with our future together, or the failure of our future together. So trust is not a question of certainty then. How do I know that you are in pain when you say you are? That's not the question. Rather, it is a question of relation, of inhabiting life together. So then what matters to me in regards to trust is less the evidence you provide than the relation that our conversation establishes. This, I think, also has something to do with the attunement of one another to the expressiveness of language, so that I'm concerned not just with, as it were, the facts of what you say, but what you express and how you express yourself in that language. This then, I think, is what it is to share a life in language. Not trusting the other's words, she says, is an effective lack of trust in the other and our mutual capacity to have a future together. So that if I hinge everything just on the question of certainty, that is a withdrawal of trust. If I need to verify to my satisfaction your pain before I respond to you, then I am, in effect, opting out of a future together, because what matters to me is my certitude in the facts of your pain, not my engagement with your expression of pain and my responsiveness to that expression. Now, Das does hesitate over the emphasis on virtue ethics that she finds in Mattingly, who we're going to talk about in just a sec, because she hesitates over this requirement of the narrative unity of one's life, as if one's life, again, this is a topic that we've opened in previous readings, but this idea that our lives are somehow transparent to us from beginning to end and have this kind of narrative continuity, narrative coherence and wholeness. Das is not totally convinced of that. At very least, she thinks it's not something that we can simply take as an assumption. Why? Because I can be opaque to myself. It's not an uncommon thing, for example, for someone to do something and then have a moment of thinking, why did I do that? This is kind of an ordinary example of the opaqueness of the self, to oneself. She opens this discussion of opacity then of the first person with Mattingly, not the piece that we read, a different piece, who argues that whatever the societal specificity of the good, striving for it, or exercising vigilance at the threat of moral tragedy, is a pan-human preoccupation, that we're all we're all preoccupied with notions of the good. We're all preoccupied with striving for it, whether we actually strive for it or not. We're not disinterested in it. We're not cavalier about it. It's an issue for us. We can see this, that we exercise vigilance both in striving for the good and at avoiding moral tragedy. So then people engage with these preoccupations not in third-person ways, but according to commitments and perspectives they've given themselves, meaning that ethics is not only an issue of these obligations that one inherits, say, from one's society, but also of moral experimentation, nodding once more to the notion that the ethical and the moral are open-ended. And so experimentation is, again, as I was trying to point out in the work that I've done on Thailand that Das just commented on, that this openness to moral experimentation is the openness of the ethical and the moral, but also sometimes experimentation is the only way to respond to a situation that is sort of on the margins of what one might have anticipated for life, so that we can have templates for all sorts of things. When we say go to a regular family festive event, a birthday or a bar mitzvah or a Christmas dinner, whatever it might be, that we have templates in place already for how to carry on in those situations. When someone overindulges, drinks too much, and gets a little bit too voluble in the midst of one of these events, again, that's something, we have a template for that. We know in some ways that that's to a certain degree expected, and so we have a sense of how to respond to it. We have a number of different ways of responding to it. Not all of life unfolds in that way, and so in the cases that Mattingly is looking at, you have people who are addressing dire circumstances that are out of the ordinary in that sense, and they respond with a certain kind of moral experimentation. We see this also in the way that Das describes the work of Samina Mullah, whose ethnography she also talks about in the cases of victims of sexual assault, where they have to make choices about how they're going to address those circumstances within their families, and that they're not transparent decisions to make. But anyway, I get ahead of myself. She points out that the stories Mattingly tells of moral experimentation nonetheless arise within established genres. So the genre of Christian redemption being one of them. But that raises for Das questions of how the first person absorbs third person genres, right? So if they're in a sense already scripted in the third person, how does the first person absorb those scripts? Does it simply speak those scripts, or does it experiment within them? Further, the people Mattingly discusses seemingly gain access to Christian genres on the strength of their contact with the second person, the suffering individual. So the presence of the second person was essential to the first person absorption of third-person genres. Again, we see this interconnectedness of the 3 points: first person, second person, third person. So then in what sense is the continuity of the first person narrative, in what sense is it that narrative continuity that secures access to ethical genres? It seems that the first person in and of itself is actually not adequate, that it's the relationship between third person genres, first person absorption of these genres, and the presence of the second person to spur the adoption of these genres in the first place, that all of these elements have to be in place. The instability of the self, Dash shows, has been a long unresolved problem for Western philosophy, to say nothing of its outright negation in Buddhist traditions, as Laidlaw has already explained. The more so when we try to tackle the place of the unconscious in the self, right? So if you accept any aspect of Freudian psychoanalysis, it's probably that we do have an unconscious. Our lives are not lived entirely consciously, that the unconscious is an element of ourselves. It is constantly exerting an influence, a pressure, a shaping force on ourself, of which our conscious selves may be somewhere between unaware and dimly aware, but the conscious self is never fully in control of it. And so the self is kind of an unstable idea, that we don't experience ourselves as completely stable, thoroughly known beings. And therefore, the idea that we have a completely coherent narrative of the self is illusory, that there are these opacities to our understandings of ourselves. There are also, then, as she explores through various linguistic and mythological cases, plural possibilities for self-formation or for ethical self-formation. Things get even more complicated with the first person plural, because when we talk about we, that unavoidably contains both I and you. It unavoidably contains first person and second person within it. The first person then is just not transparent. So we're left to contemplate the implications of this insight for virtue ethics to the extent that it relies on a transparent, coherent self. How is it now compromised? Can we... Well, so the point I think that Das wants to make here is that she's uncertain of the analytic force that virtue ethics can have for us here, to the extent that it relies on the narrative continuity of the self that is somewhat transparent to itself. She returned then to the question of how our concepts would reflect a sense of a world that is not benign. So it doesn't need to be a world that is pure malevolence, but a world in which bad things can happen. What, for example, if your picture of life is one in which violence seems to be one of its conditions? What if violence is unavoidable? And further, what if you find yourself connected to something like, say, imperialism, that you'll simultaneously disavow and yet cannot avoid supporting? She returns to Laidlaw's depiction of Lay Janes, describing an ethical life that is unlivable. And so she thinks that Laidlaw presents this as kind of a logical contradiction. That the need to eliminate attachment, a Jain principle, a way of gaining enlightenment, conflicts with the need to engage in worldly practices, therefore attachment, in order to support the renunciate ascetics, who are the great spiritual leaders of Jains. So what if what's going on there in their expression of the contradiction, Das asks, is more than just the entertaining of a logical contradiction? They might also describe an experience of life that is melancholy. And she gets this from some of the long-standing conversations between, say, Brahmins and Jains. If nonviolence is impossible, one might come to the melancholy conclusion that non-cruelty may be the highest ethical aspiration available for a human being to pursue. That nonviolence is simply not in the realm of things that we can attain. While the former does not offer a principle that allows life together, right? So nonviolence as a principle for life together simply can't work. The latter may. So we might be able to aspire to non-cruelty, even if we can't aspire to nonviolence. So given how violence shadows everyday life, and that we cannot be sure our present actions will not produce unforeseen violence in the future, might we then attain to non-cruelty, a more modest proposition than nonviolence? And so something that they have not, neither Das nor Laidlaw have entertained in the pieces that we've read, is that if the fasting to death is the greatest expression of nonviolence that a Jain could aspire to, it strikes me anyway that there is still within that a sense of doing violence to oneself in the spirit of not doing violence to other creatures. So once again, you might through that come back to the idea that even with the most perfect of ascetic practices, you may still find that violence is just unavoidable. So then, if we take the fragility of our actions, of their vulnerability to accident and a future that's beyond our control, the unavoidability of violence, if these things constitute the backdrop for ethics, that is then the site or the scene of ethics. Ethics is our responsiveness to this situation in which we cannot fully avoid violence, nor exercise complete control over our actions and their eventual outcomes. So to think about this, Das goes through part of the Mahabharata as a kind of exploration of this kind of melancholy positioning of oneself, or dispositioning, I guess, if that's a word, within the world. She says, the melancholy that marks this story, the story being the Mahabharata, comes from the realization that actions leave a trail of consequences, so that even the most virtuous person might set off a destruction because we are not the masters of our own actions. I think that we could take another tradition and look at the case of Oedipus as an example of exactly this kind of situation, that the best of intentions still produce the worst of outcomes for Oedipus. Das then positions ethics not within individuals, but in the set of relations between them. She says, one description of ethical life, or sense of the ethical, as it applies to life as a whole might be to see what kind of responsiveness we show to these conditions of human life, both in the project of self-formation and in the way we inhabit the world. In that sense, the subject of ethics is not simply an individual, but also a whole way of life. So this is I think a very challenging idea. It's one that that it feels for many counterintuitive to think of ethics as something that is not about the individual, but is about the relations that the individual shares, or the network of relations that one shares with one another, that is the ethical subject in a way. So then, following her reflections on the melancholy as a form of life, Das considers what it might be to realize that we inhabit an unjust social order, and how that realization might influence the way that we live in that social order. So let's say that we're living in an unjust society, and perhaps unwillingly or unwittingly we contribute to that injustice, or perhaps unwillingly or unwittingly we are subject to that injustice. If our response is fearful anticipation, and she cites a couple of ethnographic sources for what a life of fearful anticipation can look like, this idea that tragedy and chaos could strike at any moment, then she says the world as a whole becomes pregnant with unforeseen dangers. So the question that I want to take from this is this the condition that people are living now in the context of the pandemic? A sense not just of crisis. Certainly people have lived in a sense of crisis since March 2020, but also a kind of sense of amorphous impending catastrophe, as if this thing is not yet over, and where we might have had a moment of thinking that we could see the end, that end actually hasn't materialized. And so we live with a great deal of uncertainty around what the future holds. Is that what a world pregnant with danger looks like? Again, you can think of this on an individual basis and think that the way that impending crisis might present itself to you as experientially as you go through your days is that if you have to come in contact with other people at all, then your everyday life is sort of laced with this sense that everybody I encounter could be a vector of this virus. I can't be sure of that one way or the other. I can't know if I've been exposed or not, especially because it has this added feature of asymptomatic infection. And so this is the kind of thing that I mean about this amorphousness, this sense of impending catastrophe that could be on an individual level, or it could be at a much greater level. What if the stock market crashes as a result of the continuance of the pandemic? What would life look like then? So these are the things I'm trying to get at with this question of whether people's experiences of the pandemic have this notion of kind of being pregnant with unforeseen dangers. The other side of our vulnerability and fragility in our world is this type of anticipation that becomes our form of life, one in which the world is opaque. When will the crisis occur? When will it end? Will it end? How can I act justly in these circumstances or in this society? And the question we confront is less, how do we resolve this or that moral dilemma, than how do we endure when we are complicit in the violence that is part of our lives? She's taking the example of imperialism as the specific setting in which she's posing this question. So what I want to entertain then is whether that question is something that we can transpose onto the the moment that we're living in with the pandemic. So how is it that people endure in the face of lingering uncertainties about how to participate in what some people might think of as injustices or the unanticipated or unintentional consequences of our actions, or the unintentional and unanticipated consequences even of our best efforts to avoid being a danger to one another, avoid being a danger to strangers, and to avoid the dangers that strangers and those close to us might pose to us. Now, it's a bit unconventional the way that this piece is written, in that she says explicitly she's not trying to offer an argument. What I think we could think of her piece as doing is putting together a number of parts, a number of areas of consideration that can interlock with one another in a variety of different ways. There's not just one single way that we can connect all these different parts together, so that it's not that there is the sort of statement of a thesis, accretion of evidence in support of that thesis, and a conclusion stating how that evidence has demonstrated the thesis. Rather, I think that what she's trying to give us are these, as I say, interlocking parts that can be assembled and reassembled in different ways. So then in her conclusion, mostly what she does here is go back over the central points that she's been trying to make in each of her sections, and not say that you must fit them together in a particular way, but that they are sort of the fertile ground for a range of ways of thinking about ethics in the everyday, as arising out of the everyday or out of the ordinary. So first, moral concepts do not have sharp boundaries. One of the things that she wants to point to is that we can imagine our lives unfolding differently than they have, which allows for ways of inhabiting the everyday, not as a judge charged with separating right from wrong, the sort of Kantian judge figure, but as the ordinary, as where we engage the life of the other, with the imagination of the different possibilities of our own lives and of their lives, and experience how ethical and moral concepts force themselves upon us and upon others within those circumstances and within that sort of scope of imaginary possibility. Second, the everyday is not just given. It's not just this place where everything is settled, but rather our rendering of it depends on how we imagine it and what we take to be the corresponding threats to it. So if we think of the everyday as the domestic, threats can take the vocabulary of kinship, or will be expressed through the vocabulary of kinship. If we take it as the site of intimacy, threats will appear in the form of infidelity or the insecurity of love, our uncertainty in the faithfulness of our intimates, and so on. Third, the opacity of the world and our experience reveal, first, the limits of the constitution of the world and of the subject, and second, the ethical challenges we face upon recognizing how we may be implicated in forms of violence that we ourselves find repellent. Our response may be melancholy, enabling a more humble reckoning of our ethical possibilities, non-cruelty instead of, say, non-violence. So then rather than framing ethics in contractual terms, we might then approach ethics as our responsiveness to the needs of another. Our responsiveness, she would point out, will not always take a felicitous form. Our responsiveness might be what produces violence. So then there's this danger lurking here in imagining the everyday as a refuge from the tribulations of a world that is not benign. And so in failing to see how a form of life also generates a form of death. Last, she approaches ethics through the examples of singular individuals to think about what gives concepts life, right? Again, this idea that rather than providing a definition, that we proceed through examples. Ethics, on this view, does not have a particular isolable subject matter, but can permeate any world and thought. She says, the contrast I want is between ethics conceived as a sphere of discourse among others in contrast with ethics tied to everything there is or can be, the world as a whole, life. So I ended there, and what I hope we can get from this is a way or a set of ways of sensitizing ourselves when we interview, or when you interview people with respect to the pandemic, on not just sort of grand schemes and the large things that matter, but how small actions, small gestures, modest conversations may be, in fact, exactly the places where people are doing the greatest bulk of their ethical work in the face of the pandemic. Thank you.